Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I'm going to start with a couple of positive news items, coincidentally because just a few days ago a colleague of mine, when the topic of my podcasts came up, said, rather unkindly I thought, "You're just going to bag AUKUS again and say that we should buy everything from South Korea," which I thought was a huge generalization, but like many generalizations, there is a kernel of truth to it. So for the record, I have no problem at all with AUKUS Pillar 2. This is this technology sharing idea, hypersonics, quantum computing, all the rest of it. Don't mind that, more of it. And if other countries want to join in, be it South Korea, Japan, Canada, I don't have any problem with that either. My reservations continue with AUKUS Pillar 1 because the more that we know about this deal, or I should say the little that we are finding out about it, the more it looks like a thoroughly bad arrangement for Australia. Now, more about that later. The other comment about South Korea, buying everything from South Korea, no, clearly not. Again, another generalization, so I'm sorry if I've created that impression. I certainly think that we should buy more from South Korea, and we should definitely be cooperating with that country on a whole range of projects. I mentioned their government has offered cooperation on cybersecurity and even the joint development of a spaceport somewhere in Australia. So these, I think, are the sorts of opportunities that we should be taking advantage of when it comes to dealing with Seoul. Okay, now to the substance. And in the last week, there were two announcements, and it gives me genuine pleasure to comment on both of them. The first was on August 22nd from Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy that the government will spend $850 million on a factory in Newcastle that will manufacture missiles from Kongsberg, the Naval Strike Missile and the Joint Strike Missile. They have a lot of commonality. The quick description of the Joint Strike Missile is it is the air-launched version of the NSM. The NSM was selected in April 2022 to be installed on the Anzac frigates and the Hobart air warfare destroyers. It will also equip the Hunter-class frigates, and unless something goes dreadfully wrong, should also go on the general-purpose frigates, even though we don't yet know what that design is. Now, both of these missiles can carry out land strike, but they're really optimized for anti-ship operations. Range of all of these things is classified. For the NSM, which is a ground-launched thing, fired principally from ships, but it could also be canister launched from trucks on land. It has a range of more than 180 kilometers, and I think from memory, about a 90-kilo warhead, so it's going to do major damage to any surface ship that it hits. The JSM, shorter so that it can be carried internally in an F-35, because it will be launched at some height, and already the aircraft will be travelling at some speed. It has probably a lot more range. It wouldn't surprise me if it was up in the plus 400 kilometre category. And it's the first time that Norway, because Kongsberg is owned by the Norwegian government, and even if it wasn't, the government would have a say, it's the first time that a factory has been established in another country, partial exception being that some of these are also being produced in the United States under license by Raytheon, but this is only the second Kongsberg-owned and controlled factory outside of Norway. It will be built very quickly by the look of it. Construction time is only expected, I think, to take a year or 18 months. At RAF Base Williamtown, the industrial precinct there, and it will start producing missiles in 2027. As I say, this is a pretty brisk pace, given how long it sometimes takes for these things to occur. And once it's up and running, it will be able to build around 100 weapons per year. That is either NSMs or JSMs. As I say, the missiles are substantially similar, so it'll be up to customer demand to dictate how much of each is purchased. And also, I fully expect that it will have some expansion capacity should circumstances require production to be ramped up. And by that I mean that normally these figures of 100 missiles a year are based on working 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So if you really need to lift the rate, then you introduce a second shift or even a third shift, and then ultimately also work over weekends. It's no big deal. It just needs more people and stuff like that. Now, to make the $850 million investment viable, and that amount covers the construction of the factory and, as I understand it, the pre-ordering of some missiles, but for it to be fully viable, it's highly likely that some of the missiles are going to go to other existing or future customers. These missiles are in great demand. NSMs have been ordered by a number of countries, as has the JSM, but particularly the United States. We all know that the United States is a heavy user of these things every year, even in exercises. It's firing stuff off. So I think it's very likely that they will be a recipient of missiles coming from Australia if their own factory, singular, can't keep up with the demand. Now, that also needs to be seen in conjunction with an earlier announcement from the government and Lockheed Martin that next year they're going to start producing HIMARS weapons, HIMARS being the basic rocket fired by, GMLRS being the basic rocket fired from a HIMARS launcher. Australian production of those will begin next year, 2025, at Orchard Hills. So when you combine GMLRS manufacture and now NSM and JSM, it's actually a bundle of good news that the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Enterprise, the GWEO, has been criticised, including by me, for seeming to move quite slowly. Well, it's picking up the pace now, and obviously substantial progress is being made. Now, just the next day, there was another very positive event. Hanwha Defence Australia opened their facility co-located out at Avalon Airport of a factory that is going to be producing 30 AS9 Huntsman 155mm self-propelled howitzers and 15 accompanying combat armoured resupply vehicles, and that's going to be followed by the even larger order of 129 Redback Infantry Fighting Vehicles. Hanwha were kind enough to fly me down for the event, and it was just a really positive occasion to see some substance coming into the idea of Australian manufacture of armoured vehicles. There were a lot of dignitaries there from South Korea, from Hanwha, and from the Army. I'll come to that in a moment. And the guest of honour was Defence Minister Richard Marles. Now, after his speech, he very generously held press conference. Oh, and again, I have to explain that I try not to make these things personal or vindictive or anything like that. Richard Marles is a very nice person. He's a very likeable person. I just find myself in profound disagreement with the way that he's managing several critical parts of the portfolio. AUKUS Pillar 1, the unfolding nightmare of the general-purpose frigates, I'll come back to that as well, and the destruction and burial of Taipan helicopters. But at a personal level, he's fine. As I say, he was generous with his time, and I will give him credit at many of these events. I've seen other ministers arrive in the limo, jump out, give their speech, and then jump back in the car and disappear off to their next appointment. At least he's prepared on many occasions that I've witnessed to stay, meet people, speak to as many as he can, and generally manages to create a pretty good impression. Anyway, at the press conference, and you can find the full transcript online if anyone is interested in that detail. I'm the pest who asked questions on a number of topics. One of them was general purpose frigates, and I put the question to him that his idea of minimum viable capability might mean that if a frigate is selected from South Korea or Japan, that it will come with a South Korean or Japanese combat system. Now, he was a bit hesitant to confirm things that directly, but basically said yes. I mean, I put the question to him twice. I said, it sounds like you're saying that this is yes, and he didn't deny it. Now, as I've said before, I think that would be an absolutely profound error, because it would undo more than 20 years of work building up naval combat systems expertise here in Australia. And why anyone in their right mind would want to introduce a combat system, even though I'm sure they function very well, into the Australian mix when we already have a very good setup is completely beyond me. Now, in fact, the first question that I asked, since we were on the site of Hanwha and the Hanwha Redback, I drew his attention again to the Defence Strategic Review and the decision to cut the number of vehicles from 450 down to 129. And I reminded him that on April the 17th, when he was speaking at the National Press Club, he explained this cutback in the following terms, basically saying Australia didn't have the capacity to move all 450 overseas, and therefore the number couldn't be justified. Now, what he was referring to, I'm pretty sure, is that our 2 Canberra-class LHDs can only carry about 60 Redbacks each. Multiply that by 2, 120, that's all we're going to need. Now, I think I've pointed out on these podcasts previously, and now I pointed this out directly to him. I said, that's a nonsense. Ships can go backwards and forwards. You can have an LHD moving to and from Australia with successive loads of infantry fighting vehicles. You could move 2,000 of them. You could move 5,000 of them if you wanted to. Now, on top of that, what about some other ideas like hiring a commercial big car ferry? That surely can't be beyond the ability of the Department of Defence to do. And in extreme circumstances, each IFV can be carried by a C-17. Australia has 7 of them. Let's say that 2 of them at any one time would be out on maintenance or doing something else. That still leaves 4 that can be moving infantry fighting vehicles around the region. I don't know combat tactics for an IFV with a main battle tank. They tend to operate in multiples of 4. Let's assume it's roughly the same as an IFV. So a couple of shuttle flights of 4 C-17s over a couple of days, you're starting to talk something around 20 very advanced, heavily armed infantry fighting vehicles, sometimes in our theatre of operation. So circling back to this idea that we only need 129, I think bluntly is a nonsense. And when I put this to Minister Marles, he basically just completely sidestepped the question and waffled on about Australian forces being more manoeuvrable and deployable. Now, that's all of the good positive stuff out of the way, and we're going to have a bit of negativity because another guest at the Hanwha facility was Lieutenant General Simon Stewart, the Chief of the Army, and having waited until the busy part of the event was over, and I never like interrupting people in these sorts of things, I did manage to have a very quick word with him and offered to let him try and punch me in the face, saying I've written critically about Taipan, and if it really bothered him, he could have a swing. I'm a bit taller than he is, but he's in much better shape, so I'm glad he didn't avail himself of that offer. Anyway, I asked if it would be possible for me to sit down with him in the future to talk about Taipan helicopters, and he said, yes, sure. But the problem is, even the Chief of the Army these days can't just unilaterally agree. This all has to go back to this unit inside the department, Media Ops, which is just a front for ministerial intervention, which happens all the time. And that in turn means that even though the Chief of the Army has agreed on the record to an interview about Taipan helicopters, I can almost guarantee it won't happen because the minister or his staff will block it. Anyway, a couple of weeks ago, I couldn't participate in a media roundtable, but a colleague of mine could, so I asked him to ask this question on my behalf to the Chief of the Army. How many Black Hawk helicopters do you have in Australia at the moment, and do you regret destroying and burying the entire Taipan fleet? Now, that was a deliberately slightly provocative question. Now, I'm going to read the partial transcript. I don't have time to do all of it. And also, this is going to be the subject of a lot of further analysis. He starts by saying, I completely reject the premise of the question because it contains a number of factual inaccuracies. Yes, he would say that. Extraordinarily, he says, we haven't destroyed any Taipans. Okay, well, I think that's just flat out wrong. We might be able to quibble about the use of the word destroyed. If the Chief of the Army would prefer a title like irreparably dismantled, I guess we could do that, but they've just been effectively destroyed. I don't see why anyone would quibble about that. Anyway, he just goes on, but to quickly recap, the Taipan system never delivered what it was contractually obliged to do. It was unaffordable, at last bound, this is a literal transcript, in excess of 40,000 Australian dollars per flight hour. Now, again, that number, which has been in play for several years, has never been independently verified, and that there are reasons why Taipans are more expensive to operate than Black Hawks, and I've explained some of those. It's inherently a more complicated helicopter because it has a lot of fancy electronics. It has things like a weather radar, but it also is a helicopter with much higher performance. A Black Hawk has endurance of 2.5 hours, Taipan 4.5. There are ways of improving reliability, all of that. So if anyone in Army is hoping that I've given up on this, I certainly have not. There's a great deal more to say about all of this, and in an episode or two, I'll tackle it in further detail. And I'm just going to conclude with a further quick words about the topic that I touched on last week, this technology agreement between the US, Australia and the UK that supposedly allows a free flow of information, the one that was trumpeted by Richard Marles as a generational change. That was the same agreement claiming Australia was exporting a totally improbable $5 billion worth of gear every year to those countries. And by the way, my request to the department for a breakdown of those figures, of course, has not been met, as I knew it would be rejected because the figure is a lie. That's spelt L-I-E. And this is yet another example of the department and the government knowingly and cynically lying to the Australian public. Getting back to the agreement itself, I'll provide more analysis in the coming weeks. It turns out that many technologies are excluded, around 20% from one piece of analysis that I've read, and I'm almost certain that that 20% will represent the most critical technologies. And I find myself asking, who is negotiating and approving all of these deals? I get the feeling that our officials are signing just whatever is put in front of them, no matter how nonsensical, and Ministers Marles and Conroy are signing off on stuff without ever questioning the logic or the cost of what they're agreeing to. Okay, that's all I have time for this week. I'm going to have a break next week and have a little bit of a mental reset. So there will be a short pause, unless, of course, something dramatic happens, and I'll be resuming in a fortnight. As usual, thank you all for listening, and goodbye for now.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions, and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.